Death, a word that carries the weight of finality, echoing through every culture, every age, every individual life. It is the one certainty we are born into, the shadow that walks beside us from the first breath to the last. Kings and peasants, philosophers and warriors, saints and skeptics, none have escaped its reach. Yet, for all its universality, death remains a riddle. What is it, truly? An ending? A transformation? Or perhaps nothing more than an illusion crafted by the limits of our perception? For millennia, humanity has resisted the silence that death imposes. From the moment we first became aware of our own mortality, we began to imagine ways of transcending it. Ancient Egyptians preserved the body in golden tombs, convinced that life would continue in another world, guided by gods and guarded by rituals. In India, the Vedic seers spoke of samsara, an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, where the soul never ceases but changes form. In Greece, philosophers like Plato speculated that death was not destruction, but a passage of the soul into the realm of eternal truths. Even the Norse myths carried a vision of warriors dining forever in Valhalla after falling on the battlefield. Death, across cultures, was rarely accepted as the end. Instead, it became a doorway, a veil, a crossing point. Yet, as human knowledge expanded, science entered the stage. The scientific revolution shifted the narrative from myth to mechanism, from mystery to measurement. Death was no longer seen as a gateway to another world, but as a biological event. The cessation of heartbeat, the failure of organs, the irreversible shutting down of the brain. Within this framework, consciousness itself was reduced to neural activity, and once the brain stopped firing, so too did the self. To materialist science, death was not an illusion but the ultimate truth, the final termination of subjective experience. But is that the whole story? Or is it simply the best explanation science has crafted so far, one that might one day be overturned? The tension between myth and mechanism, between faith and science, has fueled humanity's restless search for meaning. For every culture that spoke of eternal life, science answered with observable evidence. Decay, entropy, the irreversible arrow of time. Yet for every scientist who declared death absolute, the human imagination rebelled, whispering that there must be more, that our essence, our consciousness, could not simply vanish like smoke in the wind. This struggle between certainty and doubt is not confined to ancient history. Today, even in our age of particle accelerators and brain scans, the mystery of death is no less profound. We can map the neural patterns of memory, predict the biology of aging, and revive patients who hover on the brink of clinical death. And yet, the fundamental question remains unanswered. What truly happens at the moment when life slips away? Is there a part of us that endures, something that cannot be measured under a microscope or observed in a scan? Imagine standing at the bedside of someone you love in their final moments. You see their chest rise and fall, each breath more shallow than the last. Then, a pause and silence. The body before you is unchanged in form, but something has left. Something invisible, unmeasurable. We call it life. But what do we mean by that? What is it that disappears when a person dies? Is it simply energy dissipating into the environment? Or does consciousness, in some form, slip into another realm? The sheer weight of this mystery has inspired poets, prophets, and scientists alike. Consider Shakespeare's Hamlet, who spoke of death as the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns. And yet, throughout history, there are countless stories of travelers who claim to have glimpsed it, through near-death experiences, mystical visions, or moments of transcendence. Are these accounts mere hallucinations of a dying brain, or windows into a truth that science has yet to grasp? We live in an age where myths are often dismissed, where truth is demanded in equations and experiments. But in the quest to understand death, even science begins to encounter paradoxes that defy logic. Quantum mechanics, the most successful theory in the history of physics, tells us that the universe at its deepest level does not behave according to classical expectations. Particles can be in two places at once, linked across cosmic distances, existing in states that only collapse when observed. Reality itself seems slippery, as if what we perceive is only a surface layer of a much deeper order. What if death is no different? What if what we call the end of consciousness is not annihilation, but a transition, one governed not by biology alone, but by the strange and subtle laws of the quantum world? This question, at once scientific and philosophical, stands at the edge of human understanding. On one side, the certainty of biology insists that death is final. On the other, the mysteries of physics suggest that reality itself may not be as absolute as we believe. And caught between these poles is the human spirit, yearning for meaning, unable to accept silence as the last word. Throughout history, whenever humanity has reached the boundary of knowledge, new discoveries have often shattered the assumptions of the past. Once we thought Earth was the center of the cosmos. Once we believed the universe eternal and unchanging. Once we saw matter as solid and indivisible. And each time, science revealed something stranger, more wondrous, more humbling than we had ever imagined. Why should death be any different? Why should the end of consciousness not also hold secrets that elude us, waiting to be uncovered? It is this tension between what we know and what we hope, between the measurable and the mysterious, that will guide our journey. We will walk through the great myths of humanity, the hard edge of biological science, the counterintuitive landscape of quantum physics, and the philosophical horizons where all these converge. We will weigh evidence against belief, science against speculation, reason against wonder. And through this exploration, we will return again and again to the central, haunting question. Could the quantum world prove that death is an illusion? Because perhaps the greatest illusion is not death itself, but the assumption that reality is as simple, as final, as we imagine. And if quantum mechanics has taught us anything, it is this: the universe is far stranger and far more mysterious than our ordinary senses can perceive. So let us begin. Across the sweep of history, long before microscopes and modern medicine, death was rarely seen as an end. To the ancients, it was a crossing point, a shift from one realm of existence into another, a passage that held as much mystery as birth itself. In Egypt, death was treated not with resignation, but with preparation. Pharaohs were entombed with treasures, food, even servants carved in stone, all meant to accompany them on their voyage to the afterlife. To the Egyptian mind, life after death was as real as the Nile that sustained them, and the body, carefully preserved, was the vessel that allowed the soul to journey onward. The rituals, the sacred texts, the pyramids themselves were built on a conviction. Death was transition, not finality. Far to the east, India cultivated an equally profound vision of death, woven into the doctrine of samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Here, death was neither punishment nor closure, but a continuation of existence in new forms. Karma was the thread stitching lives together, each action carrying consequences into the next cycle. The soul, or Atman, was seen as indestructible, unbound by a single lifetime. The Bhagavad Gita captures this idea with poetic clarity. Just as a person puts on new garments, discarding the old, the soul takes on new bodies, abandoning the worn-out ones. Death, in this worldview, was no more final than changing clothes. Among the Greeks, philosophy carved yet another path. Plato envisioned the soul as immortal, inhabiting bodies temporarily but belonging to a realm of eternal truths. Death was the liberation of the soul, a return to its true home, a release from the shadowy illusions of the material world. The Stoics, meanwhile, taught acceptance. Death was a natural dissolution, to be neither feared nor resisted, but met with dignity. In their writings, we find both resignation and a quiet affirmation that what we are is part of a larger order, and death is merely the continuation of that cosmic rhythm. The Norse carried their own mythic tapestry of endings and renewals. Warriors who fell bravely were welcomed into Valhalla, a hall of eternal feasting, preparing for Ragnarok, the final cosmic battle where even gods would die, only for the world to be reborn. Here, death was both an honor and a necessity in the cycle of destruction and renewal. Similarly, in Mesoamerican traditions, such as those of the Maya and Aztec, death was celebrated and ritualized, interwoven with cosmic cycles of sun and moon. Sacrifice, however brutal to our modern sensibilities, was understood as feeding the eternal cycle of life and death upon which the universe itself depended. Everywhere we look, from the burial mounds of prehistoric Europe to the elaborate rites of the East, death was less a conclusion than a transformation. Cultures embraced the mystery with symbols, rituals, and myths that all spoke of continuity. Rarely do we find the notion that death is absolute annihilation. Rather, the story of humanity is filled with visions of something beyond. A journey, a rebirth, an afterlife, a merging with the cosmos. And yet, within Western traditions that shaped the modern world, the seed of a different interpretation grew. Christianity carried the hope of resurrection and eternal life, but it also established a stark division. Heaven or hell, salvation or damnation, one life judged and sealed forever. This dualism introduced both hope and fear, and while it affirmed existence after death, it set the stage for a worldview where life was a singular chance. Later, as the Enlightenment dawned, myth gave way to mechanism. With the rise of rational science, death began to be stripped of its sacred veils. The body was no longer a vessel for a soul but a machine whose failure marked the end. Consciousness was reduced to chemistry, identity to neurons, and when the machinery stopped, so too, it was said, did the self. This materialist shift created a profound contrast with the ancient visions. Where Egyptians saw the journey of the soul, and Indians saw the recycling of spirit, modern science insisted that death was a biological event. Final, measurable, irreversible. The cosmic cycles of the Maya, the poetic immortality of Plato, the karmic rebirths of Hindu and Buddhist traditions, all were recast as stories, myths to soothe the human fear of non-existence. In their place stood a new narrative, death as the extinguishing of consciousness, an event with no continuation, no return. Yet even within the scientific worldview, doubt lingers. The sheer persistence of myths across time and culture suggests a universal intuition, that death is not simply nothingness. Humanity, across continents and centuries, has resisted the idea of absolute finality. Why does every culture, separated by oceans and ages, imagine that life continues in some form? Is it merely wishful thinking, or does it point to something deeper? A truth glimpsed but not yet understood. This is the tension we inherit today. On one hand, the weight of ancient traditions whispers that death is an illusion, that consciousness cannot simply vanish. On the other, modern materialism insists that what cannot be measured does not exist. Between these poles, we find ourselves suspended, torn between myth and mechanism, between hope and doubt. And perhaps, in that very space of uncertainty, lies the opportunity for new insight. Because if ancient cultures imagined continuity and modern science declares finality, then the next step may lie beyond both, somewhere in the frontier where physics, philosophy, and consciousness intersect. And it is here, at this threshold, that our journey must now turn. To understand death not as an end but as part of a larger reality, we must move from the stories of myth to the tools of science, to see what the modern dissection of life and consciousness truly reveals. There comes a moment in every life where the body falters, the breath slows, and a question presses into the room like a silent presence. When does life truly end? Science has worked tirelessly to answer this question with precision, stripping away myth and mystery, replacing them with measurable thresholds. The result is a modern framework that divides death into categories, each one more precise than the last. Clinical death is the first line in the sand, defined by the absence of heartbeat and breath. For centuries, this was the measure. When the chest no longer rose and the pulse vanished, a person was considered gone. But technology complicated this simplicity. With the invention of resuscitation methods and life support machines, hearts could be restarted, lungs could be forced to draw breath, and what once seemed irreversible became negotiable. This gave rise to a second, more stringent definition: biological death. Unlike clinical death, which can sometimes be reversed, biological death marks the point of no return. Here, the cells of the body, deprived of oxygen for too long, begin to deteriorate. Organs fail beyond repair. Neurons, starved of energy, die in a cascade that dismantles the very networks of memory and thought. It is the irreversible disintegration of the organism as a living system. In this framework, Death is not a single moment but a process, a gradual unraveling where the body shifts from a unified being to a collection of lifeless matter. At the center of this modern understanding stands the brain. Neuroscience has declared it the seat of the self, the command center of identity. From this perspective, consciousness is not an ethereal soul but an emergent property of neural activity. Billions of neurons firing in delicate patterns give rise to sensation, memory, awareness. Damage those patterns beyond repair, and the self dissolves. This is why brain death, the irreversible cessation of brain function, has become the ultimate marker of death in medical science. A heart may still beat on a machine, lungs may still inflate with air, but if the brain is silent, science declares the person gone. The materialist paradigm flows directly from this conclusion. According to it, consciousness is what the brain does. It arises from chemistry and electricity, no different in principle than the way a computer runs software. When the brain stops, consciousness ceases. Death, then, is not a veil or a passage but the termination of experience. In this view, there is no hidden continuation, no unseen departure. There is only the final silence when the machinery fails. It is a stark, uncompromising position, one that strips death of all mystery and places it firmly within the domain of biology. And yet, even as this framework dominates modern medicine, it leaves something unresolved. For all our brain scans, for all our measurements of neurons and synapses, science has not explained how the subjective experience of consciousness arises in the first place. We know the brain correlates with thought, but correlation is not an explanation. The leap from matter to mind remains a chasm science cannot yet cross. And so, the definition of death, anchored in the assumption that consciousness is brain activity, rests on a foundation that is still incomplete. This is where the tension sharpens. On one side, biology speaks with authority. Death is the end of the brain, the collapse of the body. On the other side, the mystery of consciousness itself resists reduction, suggesting there may be more to the story. Could death be more than the mechanical end of neural firing? Could consciousness have dimensions that biology alone cannot measure? It is here that physics enters the conversation. For if biology reduces life to the workings of cells, physics reaches deeper, to the fabric of matter, the laws that govern the universe itself. And what physics has uncovered does not align with our everyday sense of reality. It paints a picture of a world where particles exist in multiple states at once, where information is never truly lost, where reality itself may be more fluid than we dare to imagine. If biology insists on death's finality, physics whispers something stranger. And it is to this deeper science of matter that we must now turn, to ask whether death is truly what it seems. There comes a moment in every life where the body falters, the breath slows, and a question presses into the room like a silent presence. When does life truly end? Science has worked tirelessly to answer this question with precision, stripping away myth and mystery, replacing them with measurable thresholds. The result is a modern framework that divides death into categories, each one more precise than the last. Clinical death is the first line in the sand, defined by the absence of heartbeat and breath. For centuries, this was the measure. When the chest no longer rose and the pulse vanished, a person was considered gone. But technology complicated this simplicity. With the invention of resuscitation methods and life support machines, hearts could be restarted, lungs could be forced to draw breath, and what once seemed irreversible became negotiable. This gave rise to a second, more stringent definition: biological death. Unlike clinical death, which can sometimes be reversed, biological death marks the point of no return. Here, the cells of the body, deprived of oxygen for too long, begin to deteriorate. Organs fail beyond repair. Neurons, starved of energy, die in a cascade that dismantles the very networks of memory and thought. It is the irreversible disintegration of the organism as a living system. In this framework, death is not a single moment but a process, a gradual unraveling where the body shifts from a unified being to a collection of lifeless matter. At the center of this modern understanding stands the brain. Neuroscience has declared it the seat of the self, the command center of identity. From this perspective, consciousness is not an ethereal soul but an emergent property of neural activity. Billions of neurons firing in delicate patterns give rise to sensation, memory, awareness. Damage those patterns beyond repair, and the self dissolves. This is why brain death, the irreversible cessation of brain function, has become the ultimate marker of death in medical science. A heart may still beat on a machine, lungs may still inflate with air, but if the brain is silent, science declares the person gone. The materialist paradigm flows directly from this conclusion. According to it, consciousness is what the brain does. It arises from chemistry and electricity, no different in principle than the way a computer runs software. When the brain stops, consciousness ceases. Death, then, is not a veil or a passage but the termination of experience. In this view, there is no hidden continuation, no unseen departure. There is only the final silence when the machinery fails. It is a stark, uncompromising position, one that strips death of all mystery and places it firmly within the domain of biology. And yet, even as this framework dominates modern medicine, it leaves something unresolved. For all our brain scans, for all our measurements of neurons and synapses, science has not explained how the subjective experience of consciousness arises in the first place. We know the brain correlates with thought, but correlation is not an explanation. The leap from matter to mind remains a chasm science cannot yet cross. And so, the definition of death, anchored in the assumption that consciousness is brain activity, rests on a foundation that is still incomplete. This incompleteness reveals itself in edge cases that blur the boundaries of life and death. Consider patients in comas or persistent vegetative states, whose brains show minimal activity yet whose bodies continue to function. Are they alive in the fullest sense, or are they lingering between worlds? Organ donation protocols, intensive care decisions, even ethical debates hinge on how we define that line. Similarly, advances in cryonics, a controversial field where bodies or brains are frozen immediately after death, pose another challenge. If future technology could restore cellular integrity, does that mean biological death was never absolute? Each of these questions pushes against the apparent clarity of the medical definition. Neuroscience complicates the matter further with the phenomenon of near-death experiences. While mainstream explanations point to oxygen deprivation or neurochemical surges, the very fact that consciousness can produce vivid, structured experiences under conditions where the brain should be failing raises uncomfortable questions. If death is truly the end of subjective awareness, how do we account for these anomalies? Even if they are hallucinations, why do they so often converge on themes of continuity, transition, or light? The materialist paradigm may dismiss them as neural noise, but the persistence of such reports keeps the mystery alive. Moreover, the biological definition of death sits uneasily with our cultural and existential intuitions. Science may define the end as the cessation of measurable processes, but humans rarely experience it that way. For loved ones watching a passing, the sense that something has left is undeniable, though unmeasurable. Medicine speaks of oxygen levels and synaptic failure. Families speak of spirit, presence, or soul. This contrast underscores a gap between the clinical language of science and the lived reality of death. Perhaps this is why, despite the dominance of materialism, billions still cling to spiritual interpretations, as if sensing that biology cannot tell the whole story. And yet, science is not wrong. The evidence for the body's collapse is overwhelming. Entropy dictates that organisms eventually break down. The arrow of time ensures that biological systems cannot reverse indefinitely. From the level of cells to the structure of DNA, the machinery of life is fragile, and when it fails, there is no returning to the same form. The materialist paradigm, though incomplete, is rooted in undeniable facts. Bodies decay, brains cease, and consciousness as we understand it vanishes. Still, the very incompleteness of this picture invites deeper inquiry. If consciousness is reduced to brain activity, yet consciousness itself remains poorly understood, then perhaps our framework is too narrow. Biology answers the how of bodily failure, but not the what of experience. And this is where the story widens because beneath biology lies physics, the science that probes the building blocks of reality. If neuroscience tells us the brain generates consciousness, physics tells us what the brain itself is made of. particles, waves, and fields that obey rules stranger than any myth. So here we stand, caught between two narratives. One is the clarity of materialism, death as the irreversible end of biological function. The other is the unanswered riddle of consciousness, which resists easy reduction to matter. Could it be that the finality science describes is only part of the picture, that the real mystery of death is hidden in the strange patterns of the universe itself? To move closer to that possibility, we must shift our gaze. We must go deeper than biology, beneath the neurons and organs, into the realm of the quantum. For if biology insists on silence, physics may yet whisper otherwise. And it is to that whisper, to the strange, elusive laws of the quantum world, that we must now turn. There are moments in science when the curtain of reality is pulled back just enough to glimpse something utterly alien, something that defies our deepest intuitions. Step into the quantum world, and you enter a landscape where certainty dissolves, logic twists, and the familiar rules of everyday life collapse into strangeness. It is here, at the smallest scales of nature, that physics reveals not the order we expect, but a riddle that continues to haunt the greatest minds of every generation. The classical world, the one we move through daily, is comforting in its predictability. Objects have locations. Events have causes. A coin tossed into the air must land on heads or tails. But in the quantum realm, this simple logic unravels. The universe at its foundation does not seem to obey the rules of common sense. Instead, it operates on principles so baffling that Einstein himself once confessed, "The more success the quantum theory has, the sillier it looks." At the heart of this strangeness lies the principle of superposition. Imagine a coin in flight, not simply flipping between heads and tails, but existing as both simultaneously. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. A quantum particle, until observed, does not occupy a single definite state. It inhabits multiple possibilities at once, like overlapping notes in a chord, all existing together in superimposed harmony. The act of observation collapses this symphony into a single note, a single reality. But before that collapse, the particle is not either-or. It is both, and this is more than abstraction. It has been demonstrated in one of the most famous experiments in science, the double-slit experiment. Shine light through two narrow slits, and what should appear on the screen behind is two bright bands, the way bullets or pebbles would behave. But light refuses to behave so neatly. Instead, it paints an interference pattern, a series of stripes formed by overlapping waves. The light, it seems, travels through both slits at once, interfering with itself like ripples on water. It is as though each photon, each particle of light, is in multiple places at the same time. Yet the mystery deepens. Place a detector at the slits to watch which path the particle takes, and the interference vanishes. Suddenly, the photon behaves like a tiny bullet again, choosing one slit or the other. The act of measurement transforms the outcome. Observation does not merely record reality, it changes it. This collapse of the wave function from many possibilities into one actual event is one of the most profound mysteries of quantum mechanics. What does it mean? Is the universe somehow aware of our gaze? Is reality not fixed but fluid, solidifying only when consciousness calls it forth? Or is it simply that measurement, in a physical sense, disturbs the system, forcing nature into a definite state? For nearly a century, physicists and philosophers alike have debated these questions, with no consensus in sight. The collapse of the wave function remains one of the deepest riddles in all of science, a riddle that seems to blur the line between physics and metaphysics. And superposition is only the beginning. Equally baffling is entanglement, a phenomenon Einstein derisively called spooky action at a distance. When two particles become entangled, their states link in a way that transcends space. Measure one, and you instantly know the other, no matter how far apart they are. Separate them by inches or by galaxies, the connection holds. If one spins up, the other spins down, as though they are two halves of a single whole spread across the cosmos. No signal seems to pass between them, yet their fates are bound. Entanglement challenges the very fabric of locality, the principle that objects can only influence each other through direct interaction or signals traveling at finite speed. Here, it seems nature laughs at such constraints. Some physicists argue that entanglement reveals an underlying unity, a hidden order in which separation is an illusion. Others cling to mathematical formalisms, insisting that the equations work even if our intuition breaks. Either way, the phenomenon has been confirmed again and again in experiments, leaving us to wonder. If the universe is so deeply interconnected at its root, what does that mean for our understanding of reality, and perhaps even for consciousness itself? To illustrate the paradox of quantum strangeness, Schrödinger offered his now legendary thought experiment. Picture a cat sealed in a box, alongside a vial of poison triggered by the random decay of a radioactive atom. Quantum mechanics dictates that the atom exists in a superposition of decayed and not decayed states, until observed. If the atom is both decayed and intact, then the cat, by extension, is both dead and alive. Only when the box is opened, when observation occurs, does the cat's fate collapse into one definite outcome. The image is absurd, yet it captures the absurdity of applying quantum logic to everyday reality. Schrödinger intended it as a critique, but it endures as a symbol of the unsettling possibilities quantum mechanics forces us to confront. So here we are, caught between the certainty of mathematics and the impossibility of intuition. Quantum mechanics works. Its predictions power our technologies, lasers, semiconductors, quantum computers, yet its meaning remains opaque. What does it mean for something to exist in multiple states until observed? What does it mean for two particles to remain entangled across light years of space? Is reality itself indeterminate at its core? Or does it conceal hidden variables that restore order beneath the chaos? The paradox is profound. A theory so precise in practice is so mysterious in principle. It delivers answers while raising deeper questions. It humbles even the greatest minds. And in its shadows, some glimpse a doorway, a hint that reality is far stranger than our categories allow. For if matter itself can exist as possibility rather than certainty, if particles can remain linked across impossible distances, what then becomes of our assumptions about finality? Death, after all, is defined by boundaries. The boundary between life and not life, between consciousness and silence. But in the quantum world, boundaries blur. States overlap. Connections persist beyond separation. Reality refuses to conform to our simple dichotomies. Could this strangeness suggest that our understanding of death, too, is incomplete? Could superposition hint that what we call an ending may, in some sense, remain unresolved, suspended between possibilities? Could entanglement whisper that separation is an illusion, that connections endure even beyond apparent finality? These are not answers science has yet given. They are not conclusions but provocations. Yet the quantum world forces us to reconsider whether the line we draw between existence and non-existence, presence and absence, is as absolute as it seems. In the end, quantum mechanics leaves us with a paradox. A reality that works better than any theory before it, yet resists the very logic we rely upon. It asks us to embrace uncertainty, to live with the knowledge that the universe at its heart is stranger than we can imagine. And perhaps, in that strangeness, lies an opening, a chance to rethink what death truly means. For if the quantum world teaches us anything, it is that reality is never as simple as it appears. What looks like an ending may conceal another form of continuity. What looks like separation may hide a deeper unity. What looks like silence may still contain hidden symphonies. And so we leave the quantum laboratory, haunted by its riddles, carrying with us a new question. If reality itself refuses to be final, could death, too, be less final than we believe? What is consciousness? We live our entire lives immersed in it. Yet when science turns its instruments toward it, the phenomenon slips through like smoke. It cannot be weighed on a scale, photographed under a microscope, or pinned down by a single equation. And yet, consciousness is the very stage upon which every thought, memory, and dream unfolds. Without it, the universe as we know it would be silent. With it, existence blooms into color, sound, meaning, and wonder. But where does this spark come from? And could the answer lie not in biology alone, but in the strange theater of quantum mechanics? For centuries, philosophers asked whether consciousness was material or immaterial. Today, most neuroscientists lean on a materialist paradigm. The brain, with its billions of neurons, generates experience as a kind of emergent property. But this view struggles to explain the raw fact of awareness, the hard problem of consciousness, as philosopher David Chalmers called it. Why should electrical signals coursing through networks of neurons feel like anything at all? Why does matter awaken into mind? Some scientists have dared to look beyond neurons and synapses into the very building blocks of reality, and ask whether the answer might lie in the quantum realm. Among the boldest was the mathematician Roger Penrose, later a Nobel laureate, who argued that consciousness could not be explained by conventional physics or computational models of the brain. To him, the mind was not just an advanced computer. Something deeper was at play. Together with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, he proposed the orchestroir theory, orchestrated objective reduction. In this model, microtubules inside brain cells, tiny structural filaments, are not just scaffolding but quantum processors. Within them, quantum states could form, superimposed and entangled, sustaining delicate patterns of information. When these states collapsed, a quantum reduction event, they produced not just computations but conscious moments. Awareness, in this view, is woven into the quantum fabric of the brain, orchestrated by biological structures yet powered by fundamental physics. The idea electrified some and horrified others. Could the riddle of consciousness really emerge from quantum collapse? Could awareness itself be the universe experiencing its own quantum events from the inside? Supporters pointed to intriguing clues. How anesthesia, which silences consciousness, might work by disrupting microtubules. How the brain's processes seem too rich and unified to be explained by classical computation alone. Orchestroir offered a daring bridge between physics and mind. But it was not the only such theory. Long before Penrose and Hameroff, another line of thought tied consciousness to the measurement problem itself. In quantum mechanics, the wave function embodies all possible states until measurement collapses it into a single reality. But what counts as a measurement? Some physicists, including John von Neumann, suggested that consciousness plays a crucial role. Reality, in this view, does not crystallize into definite form until it is observed by a conscious mind. Without awareness, the universe remains an unresolved haze of possibilities. This became known as the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, or simply the consciousness causes collapse hypothesis. Few ideas are as tantalizing or as troubling. If consciousness collapses the wave function, then awareness is not a passive witness but an active participant in reality itself. Mind and matter intertwine at the most fundamental level. The act of observing shapes the universe. This interpretation moves perilously close to philosophical idealism. The notion that reality is in some sense mind-dependent. And yet, the mystery of measurement refuses to go away. Quantum theory demands collapse, but it refuses to say what triggers it. Some say a detector. Some say an interaction. Some whisper consciousness. Here, science stares into the abyss of speculation. On one side are those willing to leap, to suggest that consciousness and quantum mechanics are inseparable threads of one tapestry. On the other are skeptics, who warn that such ideas veer into pseudoscience. Critics argue that the brain is far too warm and wet for fragile quantum states to survive. Quantum coherence, they insist, is destroyed instantly in biological environments. The notion that microtubules maintain superpositions long enough to shape consciousness, they say, is more wishful thinking than rigorous science. Others dismiss the consciousness causes collapse idea as unnecessary mysticism. Physics, they argue, requires no such metaphysical leap. Collapse can be explained by decoherence, by mathematical formalism, or by hidden variables not yet discovered. To bring consciousness into the equation, critics contend, is to drag science back into metaphysics it worked so hard to escape. Consciousness, in this view, is an emergent phenomenon of classical complexity, not a cosmic player in the laws of physics. And yet, even the skeptics must admit, consciousness itself remains a mystery unsolved. No scan, no equation, no experiment has yet bridged the gap between brain activity and lived experience. The materialist paradigm, for all its power, cannot explain why matter feels like something from the inside. The hard problem endures, gnawing at the edges of neuroscience and philosophy alike. And in that gap, the quantum theories linger, not as proofs, but as provocations, refusing to be dismissed entirely. For what if critics are wrong about quantum fragility? Recent research in quantum biology has revealed that life does harness quantum effects, in photosynthesis, in bird navigation, even in the olfactory sense. Quantum states, it seems, can endure in biological systems longer than once thought. If evolution found a way to exploit these phenomena in plants and animals, could the human brain have tapped into them as well? Might consciousness itself be the crown jewel of quantum biology? The debate remains fiery, unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable for now. But what is clear is that quantum mechanics, with its strange rules of superposition and collapse, continues to provide a mirror in which the mystery of consciousness is reflected. Whether or not Orchestroir or the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation proves correct, they remind us that mind and matter may be bound more intimately than science has yet dared to acknowledge. And so we arrive at a crossroads. On one side lies reductionist certainty. Consciousness is nothing more than neurons firing in a complex dance. On the other lies a vision more radical, that consciousness may be woven into the fabric of the universe, flickering into existence through quantum collapse. Between these extremes lies a vast terrain of doubt, of possibility, of mystery yet unsolved. What unites all perspectives, believer and skeptic alike, is an admission: we do not yet know what consciousness is. And as long as that riddle remains unsolved, the door remains open. Open to quantum speculation, open to philosophical wonder, open to the possibility that what we call mind may not be confined to the skull, but part of the cosmos itself. Which leads us back to the question that began this journey. If quantum mechanics can challenge our notions of reality, could it also challenge our notions of death? For if consciousness is linked, however faintly, to the quantum world, then perhaps awareness is not extinguished so easily. Perhaps, like the particles it mirrors, consciousness lingers in states we do not yet understand. Death, the one frontier every human being must face, yet the one no one has ever truly returned from. And yet, there are whispers, stories, testimonies from those who have hovered at the edge of the abyss. They speak of journeys beyond the body, visions of light, encounters that defy everything we think we know about life and consciousness. These are the phenomena we call near-death experiences, NDEs. For centuries, across cultures, religions, and civilizations, these accounts have emerged with haunting similarity. The tunnel of light, a sense of detachment from the body, vivid clarity of thought, even as the brain supposedly flickers out. The reunion with deceased relatives, the overwhelming sensation of peace, as though death were not an ending but a passage. Consider ancient Egypt. The Book of the Dead spoke of a journey into another world, guided by deities who weighed the soul against a feather. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo Thodol, or Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes consciousness moving through luminous realms before rebirth. And in modern hospitals across the world, people from entirely different backgrounds, atheists, Hindus, Christians, skeptics, describe strikingly similar visions while their hearts lay silent. One of the most famous cases is that of Pam Reynolds, a woman whose brain activity was deliberately shut down during a surgical procedure. Her body temperature was lowered, her blood drained, her brainwaves flatlined. By every medical measure, she was clinically dead. Yet later, she described details of the surgery she could not have seen or heard. Tools, conversations, the exact shape of the saw used to open her skull. Such accounts make us ask, what exactly is happening here? Are these hallucinations, as skeptics suggest, or are they glimpses into something deeper, something that brushes against the very foundations of consciousness itself? Science has long struggled with these reports. On one hand, the materialist explanation is straightforward. When the brain is deprived of oxygen, neurons misfire. Visual cortex activity can generate tunnel-like visions. The release of endorphins may create feelings of peace. Hallucinations born of a dying brain could easily explain why so many people describe bright lights, floating sensations, or encounters with figures they expect to see. But then comes the harder question. How do we explain the verifiable perceptions? Patients who accurately describe medical instruments, conversations, or events that occurred while they were clinically dead. If consciousness is nothing more than neurons firing, how could awareness persist in a silent brain? Here is where quantum mechanics enters the conversation. Strange, controversial, and deeply provocative. Some researchers, like physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, suggest that consciousness may be tied to quantum processes inside microtubules, tiny structures within brain cells. If this is true, then perhaps what we call consciousness isn't just an emergent property of biology, but a deeper phenomenon woven into the very fabric of reality. In this view, when the brain ceases to function, quantum information might not simply vanish. Instead, it could disperse into the universe, like ripples fading into a vast ocean. If revived, the person might reclaim fragments of this information, memories, perceptions, experiences of an in-between realm. In other words, NDEs could be the brief crossing of consciousness beyond the boundaries of physical life. Of course, this idea has fierce critics. Many neuroscientists dismiss quantum consciousness theories as pseudoscience, a kind of wishful thinking dressed in physics jargon. They argue that the brain is far too warm and wet an environment for delicate quantum processes to survive. And they point to the unreliability of human memory, noting that recollections after trauma may be distorted or confabulated. But here's the catch. Even skeptics cannot fully dismiss the mystery, because consciousness itself remains unsolved. Neuroscience has mapped the brain in exquisite detail, yet no theory explains how electrical signals create subjective experience, the feeling of being you. And if we cannot explain the nature of consciousness, how can we so easily dismiss experiences that challenge our assumptions? Perhaps NDEs stand at the crossroads of science and philosophy, materialism and metaphysics. They remind us that the boundary between life and death is not as clear as we imagine. Consider this contrast. To the materialist, NDEs are the final flickers of a dying brain. To the experiencer, they are more real than waking life. Both perspectives are valid, both compelling, and yet both leave us with unanswered questions. Could it be that the truth lies somewhere in between? That consciousness is indeed rooted in the brain, but also capable of connecting with a deeper layer of reality. A layer where quantum information, entanglement, and the mystery of existence converge? Modern research is beginning to test these possibilities. The AWARE study, led by Dr. Sam Parnia, attempted to investigate NDEs scientifically by placing hidden images in hospital rooms, images only visible from above. If patients reporting out-of-body experiences could describe these images, it would provide strong evidence for consciousness existing beyond the body. While results so far are inconclusive, the very attempt reflects a growing recognition. Something is happening here that demands investigation. At the same time, we must resist the temptation to leap to conclusions. The human mind is a master of illusion. Memory is fragile. Expectation can shape perception. The brain's survival instincts may produce experiences that feel transcendent but are ultimately confined to neural activity. And yet, the testimonies persist. The woman who floated above her hospital bed and later recounted details no one thought she could know. The child who described meeting a deceased sibling never told about. The countless individuals who awaken from clinical death with stories of peace, light, and timeless awareness. These narratives do not prove life after death, but they do something equally powerful. They force us to confront the mystery of consciousness itself. Quantum mechanics, with its paradoxes of superposition, entanglement, and non-locality, offers a tantalizing language to frame this mystery. If particles can exist in multiple states at once, if information can be shared across vast distances instantly, then perhaps consciousness, too, is not bound entirely by the brain. Perhaps it participates in a cosmic web of information, dipping in and out of physical reality. Of course, this remains speculation, but speculation is where great scientific revolutions often begin. So we are left with a paradox. Near-death experiences may be illusions, or they may be windows into a deeper order of existence. Either way, they reveal the limits of our knowledge. They show us that death, the most universal experience of all, remains shrouded in mystery. And perhaps that is the point. The unknown keeps us questioning, searching, refusing to settle for easy answers. For if NDEs hint at anything, it is that consciousness may be far more than a biological accident. It may be a phenomenon intertwined with the quantum fabric of reality itself. And so, we arrive at the threshold of the next question. If individuals can glimpse continuity of consciousness during near-death states, what happens on a grander scale? Where does consciousness go when life finally ends? Not for minutes on an operating table, but forever. That is the mystery we now turn to, death. To most of us, it feels like the ultimate end, the last page of a book that can never be reopened. But what if death is not an ending at all? What if, hidden in the strange mathematics of quantum mechanics, there exists a possibility that you never truly die? That somewhere, in some branch of reality, your story always continues? This is the provocative idea known as quantum immortality. And at its heart lies one of the most audacious interpretations of modern physics, Hugh Everett's many-worlds hypothesis. In 1957, Everett, a young Princeton graduate student, dared to question one of the strangest puzzles in quantum mechanics, the measurement problem. In quantum theory, particles exist in a cloud of probabilities, existing in multiple states at once, until an observation collapses them into a single reality. This is what's called the Copenhagen interpretation, the mainstream view at the time. But Everett proposed something radically different. What if the wave function, the mathematical description of all possible states, never collapses at all? What if every possibility continues to exist, branching into its own universe? In one universe, the particle is here. In another, it's there. In one reality, Schrödinger's cat lives. In another, it dies. The act of observation doesn't destroy probabilities. It simply reveals which branch we find ourselves in. This vision became the many-worlds interpretation, a staggering picture of reality, in which every quantum event splits the universe into countless versions, each one as real as the next. Now imagine applying this idea not just to particles, but to you, your life, your choices, your death. Here enters the concept of quantum immortality. The thought experiment goes like this. Imagine you face a situation where survival is uncertain. A car crash, a bullet, a sudden illness. In most branches of reality, you may not survive. But in at least one branch, you always do. And from your own perspective, the only one you ever experience, you would continue to exist in the branch where you live on. Death, then, is never absolute. It is only experienced by others. For you, consciousness marches forward indefinitely into the branches where you never die. The idea is as thrilling as it is terrifying. To picture death not as a wall, but as a door opening endlessly into new corridors of existence. To imagine that no matter what happens, there is always a version of you that survives, the ultimate escape from oblivion. But let us pause here. Is this really physics? Or is it philosophy draped in quantum clothing? Supporters argue that quantum immortality is simply an extension of the many-worlds framework. If all possibilities happen, then logically survival always happens somewhere. Critics, however, point out that this is not a testable hypothesis. You cannot design an experiment to prove that you continue in another branch. For everyone else, your death in this universe is final. From their perspective, you are gone. This clash between wonder and skepticism captures the essence of quantum immortality. On one side, it offers a staggering, almost spiritual vision of consciousness flowing eternally through branching universes. On the other, it risks slipping into pseudoscience, a metaphysical speculation that cannot be confirmed or denied. And yet, it grips the imagination. Think of the implications. If true, death is never the end of subjective experience. Consciousness is never interrupted. You awaken again and again in the universes where survival occurs, perhaps with scars, perhaps changed, but always alive. The thought echoes with ancient myths of eternal life, reincarnation, and resurrection, but recast now in the language of quantum physics. Some theorists even connect this idea with the anthropic principle. You are only ever conscious in universes that allow your consciousness to exist. Therefore, by definition, you can never experience your own death. To you, there will always be another tomorrow. But if this is so, what does it mean for the value of life? If one version of you always continues, does that make choices meaningless? If you are guaranteed survival in some branch, does death lose its significance? Or does it make every moment even more precious, knowing that infinite versions of your story are unfolding, each with their own struggles, triumphs, and sorrows? The imagery here is profoundly cinematic. Picture death not as the closing of eyes into darkness, but as a split, a branching path in a cosmic forest of realities. One version of you lies still, while another gasps awake. A bullet strikes in one world, misses in another. A heartbeat falters here, yet continues there. Across the infinite tapestry of universes, your consciousness threads its way, always finding the branches where it survives. But can we truly call this immortality? After all, from the perspective of family and friends in this world, you die. Your absence is real. Graves are dug, tears are shed. Quantum immortality may only preserve the first-person perspective. In this sense, it is a deeply solitary vision, eternal survival experienced only by you, never shared. Philosophers debate whether this even counts as survival at all. If countless versions of you already exist, is the continuation of one branch truly you, or simply another copy? Is identity preserved across infinite splittings, or is it diluted into an endless sea of variations? And yet, even critics admit the idea cannot be dismissed outright, because the many worlds framework itself remains one of the most serious interpretations of quantum mechanics. Many leading physicists accept it as a plausible, perhaps even inevitable, description of reality. If that is the case, then quantum immortality is not just fantasy. It is a logical, if unsettling, consequence. There is a certain poetic resonance here. For centuries, humans have yearned for immortality. Religions promised eternal life in heaven, rebirth in new forms, liberation from the cycle of death. Science, too, now whispers of a strange eternity, one not in the afterlife, but in the endlessly splitting fabric of the cosmos. Still, let us not forget the limits of our knowledge. Quantum mechanics is a theory of probabilities, not certainties. Many worlds is compelling, but unproven. Quantum immortality, even more so, may be an illusion, a mirage born from our refusal to accept the finality of death. And yet, illusions can be powerful. They force us to question what we take for granted. They invite us to expand our imagination, to entertain possibilities that stretch the boundaries of science and philosophy alike. So we return to the haunting question. If death is not absolute, if reality endlessly branches into new paths, what does that mean for us? Does it mean we are trapped in an eternal survival loop, never finding true rest? Does it mean we are immortal in the most unsettling sense, always living, always continuing, never reaching an end? Or does it mean something more subtle, that our identities are not singular, but fractal, scattered across a multiverse where every possibility plays out? In that case, perhaps death is not a defeat, but simply a shift of perspective, a passage into another branch where the story goes on. One thing is certain: in contemplating quantum immortality, we are forced to confront the very nature of existence. We are asked to rethink what it means to live, to die, to persist. And perhaps the true power of this idea lies not in whether it is scientifically provable, but in how it reshapes our vision of life itself. To see death not as a wall, but as a door. To imagine that behind every ending lies another beginning. To recognize that in the quantum universe, nothing is ever truly lost. So if death is not absolute in physics, if the many worlds offer us infinite continuations, what does that mean for us? Not as theories, but as human beings searching for meaning. That is the mystery we now turn toward. In physics, there is a rule so fundamental, so deeply woven into the fabric of reality, that it challenges even our most common assumptions about death. It is the principle of information conservation, the idea that information can never be destroyed. Matter may burn, energy may dissipate, forms may change, but the information that describes the state of a system is never lost. It is preserved, encoded, transformed, but never erased from the cosmic ledger. At first glance, This may sound abstract, almost irrelevant to the mystery of human mortality. But pause for a moment and imagine what it means. If the universe keeps track of every configuration, every particle, every quantum state that has ever existed, then perhaps nothing, no memory, no experience, no trace of who we are, ever truly disappears. We may die, but the information that made us could still echo in the cosmos. This principle comes into sharp focus in one of the greatest puzzles of modern physics: the black hole information paradox. Black holes, those devouring engines of gravity, were once thought to be cosmic erasers. Anything that crossed their event horizon, matter, light, even entire stars, was swallowed forever. According to Einstein's general relativity, the collapse was total. Whatever fell inside was crushed into a singularity, and all details of its existence were lost to the outside universe. But this conclusion clashed violently with quantum mechanics, which insists that information cannot be destroyed. In the 1970s, Stephen Hawking deepened the paradox when he showed that black holes are not eternal prisons. They emit radiation, what we now call Hawking radiation, and can eventually evaporate into nothing. The problem was chilling. If black holes vanish, and the information about everything they consumed vanishes with them, then physics itself would be broken. The laws of quantum mechanics, the most reliable framework of science, would collapse. For decades, physicists wrestled with this contradiction. Does information truly disappear inside a black hole? Or is it somehow preserved, encrypted in ways we cannot yet decipher? Some argued that information is smeared across the event horizon in a two-dimensional code, giving rise to the holographic principle, the idea that the universe itself might be a kind of projection of deeper information. Others suggested that Hawking radiation carries subtle imprints of the matter that fell in, slowly leaking information back into the cosmos. Though the debate rages on, the consensus has leaned toward preservation. Information, though scrambled, is never truly erased. The universe remembers. Now extend this principle to ourselves. If our brains, our thoughts, our consciousness are physical processes, patterns of quantum information encoded in matter, then can they ever be completely lost? When we die, the body decays, the brain shuts down. But the information that once described us, could it persist in some hidden form, woven into the fabric of space-time? It is here that physics brushes up against philosophy. On one hand, information conservation offers a tantalizing picture of immortality. You are not obliterated, you are transformed. The universe carries the record of your being, as indelible as the ink of mathematics. On the other hand, information is not the same as identity. A book shredded into a million scraps still technically contains information, but the story is unreadable. A song dissolved into static still holds traces of its melody, but the music is gone. This tension raises the crucial question: what exactly does it mean for you to persist? Is continuity of information enough? Or does identity require something more, a coherence, a lived narrative, a subjective thread of consciousness that cannot be reduced to bits of data? Consider again the black hole. If information survives in scrambled form, is that equivalent to survival? Or is it survival in name only, the ghost of a pattern that can never be reconstructed? Some physicists and philosophers suggest that consciousness, if it is indeed quantum information, might be more robust, perhaps entangled across the fabric of reality, preserved in subtle correlations that transcend death. Others dismiss this as wishful thinking, arguing that while information may endure, the self does not. What remains are fragments, not the flame. Yet the allure of information immortality persists. It resonates with our oldest myths. The Egyptians carved hieroglyphs to preserve the names of the dead, believing that remembrance was a kind of survival. In Eastern traditions, karma functions as an informational thread, carrying imprints of one life into the next. Today, in the language of physics, we find echoes of these ancient intuitions. Nothing is truly forgotten. The imagery is haunting. Imagine your life as a unique pattern of quantum states, a ripple in the sea of information. Death scatters the wave, but the ripple never vanishes. Somewhere, written into the equations of the cosmos, the trace of your existence endures. To some, this offers comfort. To others, it is cold survival without self, eternity without awareness. Skeptics warn against confusing physics with metaphysics. Information conservation is a law about particles, not people. To equate it directly with immortality is to leap from science into speculation. After all, the information contained in a burned photograph still exists in smoke and ash, but the picture is lost forever. Likewise, the atoms and quantum states of our brains may persist, but the experience of being, our memories, our emotions, our awareness may be irretrievable. And yet, the mystery refuses to die. Even Hawking himself wrestled with the implications, revising his views late in life to suggest that information does, indeed, escape black holes. If the universe preserves even the tiniest details of a collapsed star, can it truly allow the story of a human life to vanish into nothing? The fascination only deepens when we realize how closely tied information is to the structure of reality itself. According to some physicists, information is not merely a property of the universe, it is the universe. Reality may be, at its most fundamental level, a vast computation, a cosmic code unfolding across time. If so, then consciousness is not an accident but an expression of information, an emergent song sung by the universe to itself. And songs once sung leave echoes. But again, we return to the boundary line. Information is not identity. Knowing that the notes of a song still exist does not mean the performance continues. Knowing that ashes contain the information of a photograph does not mean we can see the smile of a loved one. If consciousness is more than information, if it requires a dynamic process, a living stage, then perhaps its end is real, final, and unbroken by the laws of physics. This is the paradox we face. Physics tells us information never dies. Yet philosophy reminds us that information without form is meaningless. Between these poles lies the enigma of our mortality. Are we patterns that endure, or flames that flicker and fade? And so we arrive at the next frontier. If information endures, but identity may not, then where do we draw the line? What is the essence of you? Is it the data encoded in your neurons, or the living experience of your awareness? Is immortality the persistence of information, or the survival of identity? The answers lie in the shadows between physics and philosophy, in the narrow gap between science and meaning. And that is where we must go next. For thousands of years, humanity has looked at death and asked the same question. Is this the end, or is it only a veil? In the East, great philosophies answered with a startling claim that death itself is an illusion. In the teachings of Hinduism, the world of appearances is Maya, a dreamlike stage where birth and death are roles played in an endless cosmic drama. The self, they say, is not the body, not even the fleeting mind, but the Atman, an eternal essence, indivisible and untouched by change. The body comes and goes, like a set of clothes, but the true self persists. This vision is not abstract. It shaped entire civilizations. The temples of India, the chants of monks, the meditations of mystics, all built on the conviction that life and death are passing waves on a boundless ocean. To die, in this view, is not to vanish, but to shift, to cross into another pattern of being, as consciousness takes on new form in the cycle of rebirth. Buddhism offered its own nuance. It spoke less of an eternal soul and more of a continuum of consciousness, a process rather than a thing. Life and death are like the flame of one candle lighting another. There is continuity, but no fixed identity that survives unchanged. What we fear as death is only transformation, the rearrangement of causes and conditions. To see this clearly, the Buddha taught, is to dissolve fear. For if there is no permanent self to cling to, there is nothing that can truly be lost. Now, fast forward thousands of years. Modern science, especially physics, claims to describe reality in measurable terms. And yet, in its most advanced form, quantum mechanics, it too arrives at a world that looks far from solid, far from final. At the quantum level, particles do not behave like little billiard balls. They exist as probabilities, waves of possibility smeared across space and time, collapsing into definite states only when observed. The universe, it seems, is not a machine grinding along predictable gears, but a field of potential, uncertain until it takes form. This has staggering implications. If the building blocks of reality are indeterminate, then what we call life and death may themselves be emergent illusions, fixed only from the limited vantage point of human perception. Matter is never destroyed. Energy never disappears. They shift, transform, reorganize. So why should consciousness, the most mysterious phenomenon of all, be the lone exception? Here we meet a striking resonance between East and West. Where Eastern mystics spoke of Maya, the illusory nature of birth and death, modern physics speaks of wave functions, of probabilities waiting to collapse. Both suggest that the world we see is not ultimate reality, but a surface layer hiding something deeper. And yet, there is tension. Western realism, rooted in Greek philosophy and carried forward into modern science, insists that death is the final fact. For materialists, the body is the person, the brain is the mind, and when the neurons cease to fire, the story ends. Death is not a doorway but a wall. The flame goes out. Nothing remains. This view has its own clarity, its own power. It strips away comforting illusions and demands courage in the face of finitude. Tells us you have one life, one chance. Make it count. But quantum physics quietly unsettles this certainty. Information, it seems, cannot be destroyed. At the deepest level, the universe is a vast ledger where every interaction, every quantum state, is preserved. Could it be, then, that consciousness too is woven into this fabric, that death, rather than annihilation, is simply the folding of one pattern into another? Let us pause here and reflect. The Western realist looks at death and says, "Here lies the end." The Eastern sage looks at death and says, "Here begins another illusion." And the physicist, staring at equations and experiments, whispers, "Reality is stranger than either view admits. What emerges is not certainty, but convergence." Mystics spoke in poetry, scientists in mathematics, yet both circle the same insight. The finality of death may itself be a misunderstanding. Consider this: when we dream, our mind constructs entire worlds. Time passes, characters appear, emotions surge. Within the dream, it feels utterly real until we wake. The Eastern claim is that waking life itself is another kind of dream, sustained by Maya. And physics now tells us that the solid world is, at its base, a dance of probabilities, a dream of particles appearing and disappearing, real only in relation to observation. So the question becomes, what is real? If death is not the final fact, then what lies beyond it? If endings are illusions, what is the greater reality they conceal? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one vision over the other, but in holding them together. The West reminds us of mortality, of urgency, of the preciousness of our finite days. The East reminds us of continuity, of the eternal, of the possibility that nothing is ever truly lost. Physics ties them both together, suggesting that what we call reality is more mysterious than either tradition dared to imagine. And so we stand at a threshold. Death, once feared as the great destroyer, may instead be the great revealer, the place where illusion dissolves and the deeper fabric of reality begins to show itself. The ancient sages asked us to see death as an illusion. Modern physics suggests that reality itself may be illusory. Between these visions, a bridge forms, and across that bridge, a haunting, exhilarating possibility emerges. If death is an illusion, then what is the real? From the moment our species first stood upright, gazing across the vast plains of Africa, one haunting awareness separated us from every other creature. We not only lived, we knew we would die. That knowledge, the awareness of our own mortality, became the silent architect of human civilization. Every tool, every myth, every ritual fire lit against the darkness was born not just from survival, but from a deeper terror, the knowledge that one day survival would fail. Anthropologists tell us that even the earliest humans performed burial rituals. Graves dating back tens of thousands of years show signs of care. Flowers placed beside bones, red ochre smeared over the remains. Why decorate a corpse, if not to comfort ourselves with the belief that something continued after the body was gone? Here, at the very dawn of our history, we see the beginnings of religion, of culture, of symbolic thought, all entwined with death. Fear of death, it seems, was not a weakness but a survival advantage. This is the core of what psychologists today call terror management theory. The argument is simple, yet profound. Creatures that know they will die must find ways to manage that terror, or else be paralyzed by it. Culture, morality, and belief systems became psychological armor, shielding us from the abyss. By imagining afterlives, higher powers, or eternal legacies, humans were able to endure the crushing weight of mortality. Think about it. A lion fears pain. A gazelle fears the predator's teeth. But neither lies awake at night imagining its own demise. Only humans carry this burden. And in carrying it, we built entire civilizations. The pyramids of Egypt rise from the desert like stone prayers to eternity, monuments designed to defy decay. Ancient Mesopotamian epics, like the story of Gilgamesh, wrestled openly with the inevitability of death. In India, the Upanishads spoke of reincarnation and liberation. In Greece, philosophers debated the soul's fate. Across the world, myths of afterlife and rebirth sprouted like parallel answers to the same question. What happens when we die? And yet, beneath the myths, a harder truth was at work. Awareness of death forced cooperation. It compelled us to create meaning, to build communities, to codify laws, to protect one another. By facing mortality, we became more than individuals, we became societies. Death, ironically, gave birth to culture. But here is the paradox. The very awareness that helped us survive also condemned us to endless anxiety. Consciousness evolved not only to navigate the external world, but to confront the internal storm of existential dread. Was it possible, then, that consciousness itself, the crown jewel of evolution, arose precisely because of death? It's a bold speculation, but consider this. Intelligence gave us tools, but self-awareness gave us fear. Fear sharpened vigilance, vigilance improved survival, and survival passed on genes. Perhaps the mind that contemplates infinity, the mind that dreams of gods and souls, exists only because of a relentless biological truth. Creatures that ignored death did not last. Here we meet a fork in interpretation. The scientific view tells us that culture and consciousness are adaptive responses to evolutionary pressures. Religion, philosophy, and even art are survival mechanisms dressed in beauty and myth. From this perspective, the grandest cathedral or the quietest prayer is not evidence of cosmic truth, but of neural strategies designed to keep a fragile species sane. Yet, on the other side lies mystery. If evolution merely needed us to survive and reproduce, why give us minds capable of pondering eternity? Why awaken in us the aching suspicion that death is not the end? Why does the awareness of mortality lead not just to fear, but to transcendence, to visions of realities beyond the material? Some would say this is nothing more than an accident of neural complexity, a side effect of brains too large for their own good. Others whisper that in our awareness of death, something more profound is revealed. That consciousness itself is not reducible to biology, but a window into deeper layers of reality. This tension, science versus speculation, evidence versus mystery, has shaped human history as much as death itself. One camp insists that our yearning for immortality is a trick of evolution, a psychological bandage. The other camp sees in that yearning a clue, perhaps the greatest clue, that life extends beyond what we can measure. Either way, the influence of death on human origins is undeniable. The myths we tell, the structures we build, the very stories we pass across generations, all carry the imprint of mortality. The fear of death did not paralyze us. It propelled us. In running from it, we created civilization. But let us linger on this question. Could it be that our most human trait, the restless, searching mind, was born from the shadow of death itself? That the very consciousness asking these questions exists because our ancestors trembled before the unknown? If so, then death is not only an end but also a beginning. It is both the terror that shaped us and the mystery that continues to define us. Evolution gave us bodies to survive, but perhaps death awareness gave us souls. Whether literal or metaphorical, it opened the door to something greater than mere survival. And so we arrive at the heart of the matter. From burial rites to epic myths, from stone monuments to philosophical treatises, The story of human origins is inseparable from the story of death. To understand who we are, we must understand what death has made of us. For even now, in the age of quantum physics and neuroscience, the question remains. We can trace the evolutionary utility of fearing death. We can explain the psychological need for meaning, but we cannot silence the deeper voice that keeps asking, is this all there is? Or is death merely the first step into a larger, hidden reality? This is where evolution's pragmatism meets humanity's yearning. Evolution explains how death awareness shaped our species, but it cannot fully explain why the question of death still burns within us, why it refuses to be reduced to biology alone. And so, the story turns. We began with survival. We end with mystery. Our ancestors feared death and built civilizations to shield themselves from it. But we, their descendants, inherit not just the fear, but the wonder, the haunting sense that death may be more than an end. Transition. And this brings us to the next frontier. For if evolution gave us the awareness of death, modern humanity demands more than survival. We demand answers. We demand meaning. We yearn to know not just how death shaped us, but what death truly is. For centuries, science has been driven by one central conviction: that matter is fundamental, and consciousness is an emergent property of matter. The brain, with its labyrinth of neurons and firing synapses, is seen as the theater where the play of awareness unfolds. But what if this assumption is backwards? What if consciousness is not a byproduct of matter, but something deeper, more fundamental, woven into the very structure of reality itself? This is the frontier, where philosophy, science, and imagination collide. A place where evidence thins, but questions sharpen. Panpsychism, simulation theory, and cosmic consciousness, all ideas dismissed by many as fringe, yet each with a strange gravitational pull. Together, they hint that perhaps consciousness is not trapped inside the skull, but stretches far beyond it. Panpsychism begins with a simple, startling claim. Consciousness is not rare, it is universal. Every particle, every atom, every field of energy possesses some rudimentary spark of experience. A rock, a river, a tree, they may not think, but they participate in a field of awareness too vast to measure. This view is not new. Ancient philosophies from India to Greece once spoke of a world suffused with spirit, of life force in all things. What is new is the return of this idea in the language of modern philosophy and physics. Thinkers like Galen Strawson and Philip Goff argue that materialism fails to explain how subjective experience arises from objective matter. Neurons can be mapped, synapses measured, but no scan reveals the color red as it is seen, or the feeling of fear as it is felt. This gap, the infamous hard problem of consciousness, has resisted every scientific attempt to close it. Panpsychism offers a bold alternative. Consciousness is not produced at all. It was here from the beginning, embedded in matter like a hidden code. But not everyone agrees. Critics argue panpsychism explains nothing, only pushes the mystery down to the level of electrons and quarks. And yet, there is a quiet power in the idea. If awareness is a fundamental property of reality, then death may not erase consciousness entirely. It may only dissolve one configuration of awareness into the wider ocean that birthed it. If panpsychism whispers that consciousness is everywhere, simulation theory suggests that reality itself may not be what it seems. Imagine this: advanced civilizations, capable of unimaginable computing power, simulating entire universes indistinguishable from their own. Within those simulations, beings evolve, live, and ask questions, never realizing they are lines of code running on a machine. Nick Bostrom famously argued that if such simulations are possible, the probability that we ourselves are inside one is not small. After all, the number of simulated universes could vastly outnumber the original. If this is true, then death may not be the final annihilation we fear. It may be no more than a program shutting down, a character exiting the script, while the deeper system continues. The laws of physics we measure might be nothing more than the rules of the simulation, consistent, elegant, but not ultimate. Again, skepticism rises. Many physicists dismiss the simulation argument as unfalsifiable, a philosophical trick dressed in digital clothing. And yet, The eerie fit between information theory, quantum mechanics, and the fabric of the universe keeps the idea alive. Our cosmos is written in mathematics, structured like code. Perhaps the very sense of consciousness we hold is evidence of a deeper layer of reality, an operating system beyond our comprehension. Then comes the most daring proposition of all cosmic consciousness. Here, the claim is not that particles are conscious or that simulations produce awareness, but that the universe itself is a living, conscious entity. From Eastern philosophies like Advaita Vedanta to Western mystics and even some modern physicists, the suggestion arises again and again. Consciousness is the ground of being. Matter emerges from it, not the other way around. Imagine a vast ocean, infinite and unbroken. Each individual consciousness is like a wave rising from its surface. When a wave falls, it is not destroyed, only reabsorbed into the ocean. This metaphor captures the essence of cosmic consciousness. Death is not an ending, but a return. Science, however, is cautious. Neuroscientists insist that consciousness correlates with brain activity. Damage a brain and the light of awareness dims. End the brain's function and the experience ceases. From this view, cosmic consciousness is poetry, not physics. But on the edges of research, cracks appear in the materialist wall. Quantum biology is one such crack. Scientists exploring photosynthesis, bird navigation, and even the olfactory system have found hints that quantum effects, superposition, entanglement, tunneling, may play roles in living systems. If life itself exploits quantum weirdness, could consciousness do the same? The Penrose-Hameroff Orchestroar model suggests that microtubules within neurons might sustain quantum processes, linking awareness to the fundamental fabric of reality. Though controversial, it dares to bridge mind and matter in ways neuroscience alone has not. And then there is artificial intelligence. Machines are growing ever more capable, generating language, images, and decisions that mimic human thought. Yet the question lingers: do they know they are doing it? Are they aware, or only simulating awareness? The test for AI consciousness is not yet written, but the search itself reveals our deeper uncertainty. If we cannot define consciousness clearly, how can we ever know where it begins or ends? At the same time, psychologists and neuroscientists are conducting experiments on death awareness itself. Studies show that confronting mortality changes behavior in profound ways. People reminded of their mortality cling harder to cultural beliefs, seek meaning, and sometimes become more compassionate. Death, it seems, is not only a biological event but a psychological force that shapes our lives even before it arrives. Still, skepticism remains fierce. To many scientists, panpsychism, simulation theory, and cosmic consciousness are not answers but distractions. They argue that until hard data supports them, these ideas belong to metaphysics, not science. For every paper proposing quantum effects in the brain, there are others dismissing the evidence as noise or misinterpretation. For every philosopher invoking cosmic awareness, there are neuroscientists pointing to brain scans that vanish at death. Yet even skeptics admit a stubborn truth: consciousness itself has not been solved. We can map its correlates, model its mechanisms, but the raw fact of subjective experience remains untouched. Why should atoms arrange themselves into awareness at all? Why should matter know itself? Here, science falters and philosophy steps in to keep the question alive. This is the edge, the frontier, not where certainty resides, but where wonder thrives. Beyond the laboratory, beyond equations, lies the vast unknown. Perhaps consciousness is woven into particles, or simulated by codes, or expanded across the cosmos. Or perhaps it is something we cannot yet imagine, something waiting beyond the horizon of current knowledge. And this returns us inevitably to death. For if consciousness is more than matter, death may not be final. If awareness is written into the fabric of reality, then what we call an ending may only be a transformation. If reality is a simulation, then death may be an exit, not annihilation. If the universe itself is conscious, then every individual life is a ripple within its eternal mind. But if the skeptics are right, then death is the great eraser, and our yearning for more is the price of knowing we must end. The choice between these visions defines not only our science, but our humanity. And so we stand at the frontier, gazing into a darkness that may be infinite or illusory. Science may never resolve it fully. Instruments can measure brain waves, telescopes can capture galaxies, but the raw fact of awareness slips between the cracks of data. Here, philosophy keeps the door open, reminding us that not knowing is not failure, it is mystery. Perhaps this is what makes us human. The refusal to accept that death is simple, the insistence that consciousness must mean something more. Whether that more is panpsychism's universal spark, simulation's hidden code, or the boundless sea of cosmic awareness, the very act of wondering reshapes our reality. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The oldest truth we know is also the one we fear the most. Everything that lives must die. It is the law written into the stars, the forests, the tides, and the fragile beat of the human heart. We began this journey by staring into that inevitability, into the silence that follows the last breath, and asking, is this the end? Or is death only the beginning of something we cannot yet see? Through history, we saw civilizations weaving myths to soften the terror. Egyptians with their Book of the Dead, Hindus and Buddhists with their cycles of rebirth, Greeks with their shadowy underworlds. Each culture offered a story, not because it knew the truth, but because it could not endure the silence of unknowing. Then came science, stripping away myth with microscopes and scalpels, declaring that death is simply the shutting down of biology. And yet, just when certainty seemed within reach, quantum physics cracked open the door again, whispering that reality itself may not be what it seems. We entered the strange domain where particles exist in two states at once, where information refuses to be destroyed, where the very act of observation changes what is real. In this world, consciousness is not easily explained away. It hovers like a ghost inside equations, daring us to ask if perhaps our awareness is tied not to matter alone, but to the very fabric of the cosmos. Near-death experiences, debated yet persistent, lend stories of minds alive when bodies should be silent. Panpsychism, simulation, cosmic consciousness, each one a mirror reflecting back the same possibility. Death may be less an end than a transformation. But here, at the conclusion, humility must return. Science does not yet prove immortality. It does not promise a soul, nor guarantee that we survive beyond the grave. The instruments of neuroscience show minds dimming as brains fail. The weight of biology reminds us that every system has its breaking point. Against this, the possibilities of quantum immortality or eternal consciousness may be visions more poetic than proven. And yet, even if uncertain, they carry a gift. They allow us to imagine. If death is not final, then every moment is not leading to nothingness but to transformation. If consciousness is more than matter, then who we are may ripple beyond the skin, beyond the years, into something vaster than ourselves. And even if all of these ideas remain unprovable, the act of contemplating them changes how we live. Awareness of mortality is not just a shadow. It is also a lantern. It sharpens our love, deepens our wonder, forces us to make meaning while we can. Maybe the real illusion is not death, but the belief that we ever truly end. Perhaps we are like waves returning to the sea, distinct for a time, yet never separate from the ocean that holds us. Or perhaps we are notes in a cosmic song, fading in one key only to reappear in another. What if the boundary we call death is less a wall and more a doorway, less an erasure and more a shift? In the end, science can take us far, but not across that final threshold. Beyond it lies mystery, whether silence or light or something stranger still. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the meaning of death is not found in escaping it, but in allowing it to remind us of the fragility, the beauty, and the sacredness of being alive at all. So when we return to that opening question, could the quantum world prove that death is an illusion? The honest answer is that we do not know. But within that uncertainty lies the spark of awe, the invitation to live as though each breath matters, each moment is eternal, each connection we make ripples farther than we can see. For if death is not the end, then perhaps nothing is ever truly lost. And even if it is, the wonder remains that we were ever here at all. Death, then, is not only the great leveler of kings and beggars, but the mirror that forces us to look inward. Every civilization that ever rose on this planet eventually had to wrestle with the silence that comes when breath leaves the body. To the Sumerians, the afterlife was a shadowed underworld. To the Egyptians, it was a vast cosmic journey guided by divine judgment. To the Hindus, a wheel of rebirth and liberation. Across cultures, one pattern echoes. Humanity has never been able to accept death as simple nothingness. The very fact that we resist it so fiercely might itself be the greatest clue that perhaps our consciousness is not wired for annihilation. If the end of life were self-evident, why did we build such elaborate myths, rituals, and philosophies around its supposed continuation? Why spend thousands of years crafting temples, burning incense, and reciting prayers for the dead if, deep down, the human psyche did not sense that something more lingers? This intuition may not be proof in the scientific sense, but it is evidence of another kind, a collective yearning, perhaps even a collective memory, that the story does not stop when the body falls. Science pushes back, of course. The neuroscientist reminds us that when neurons cease firing, when electrical signals collapse into silence, the mind dissolves. According to this view, death is not a doorway but a final blackout, irreversible and absolute. Yet even here cracks appear. Near-death experiences, though hotly debated, describe patterns that defy easy dismissal. The tunnel of light, the sense of floating, the sudden review of one's entire life in a single burst of perception. Skeptics attribute these to oxygen deprivation or chemical floods in a dying brain, but the accounts are strikingly similar across cultures, across centuries, across oceans. Why does the brain, in its last flickers, reach for imagery so archetypal and consistent? Could this be more than a failing machine's hallucination? Could it be a glimpse into another layer of reality? Here is where philosophy steps in, not to replace science, but to frame its limits. The philosopher of mind asks, even if neurons explain the machinery, do they explain the experiencer? The feeling of I, the subject looking out of the eyes, hearing the words, tasting the moment, remains stubbornly elusive. And if the experiencer cannot be fully dissected, can it be destroyed? A candle may extinguish, but does the flame truly die? Or is it only transformed into invisible heat, absorbed into the air? Perhaps consciousness, too, is not so much ended as redistributed, returning to a field from which it once arose. If death is an illusion, then life itself takes on a different hue. Every argument, every ambition, every fear loses its sharp edge when framed against eternity. What meaning does envy have if existence continues beyond the skin? What power does greed hold if the self outlives possessions? To believe that death is transformation rather than termination is not an escape from responsibility. It is, paradoxically, an intensification of it. For if nothing truly ends, then every choice ripples infinitely, every act matters beyond the horizon of our current perception. Imagine, then, what it would mean if civilizations lived not with the terror of death, but with the trust of continuity. Our ancestors built pyramids, cathedrals, and sacred fires to defy the grave. What might we build if we no longer feared it at all? A species unshackled from death terror might focus not on monuments of stone, but on monuments of compassion, knowledge, and interconnectedness. Perhaps the next stage of our evolution is not merely biological but philosophical. To see through the illusion of ending, and in doing so, to step into a wider consciousness that has always been waiting. And yet, humility tempers this vision. We do not know. We cannot know, at least not in the way science demands. We walk with mystery, and perhaps that is precisely the point. The poet and the physicist, though they speak different languages, both recognize the limits of their craft. Beyond the last equation, beyond the final stanza, there is silence. But silence is not nothing. It is potential, the quiet out of which music, life, and even galaxies emerge. So maybe death is not an enemy to be defeated, nor a wall to crash against, but the silence between notes, a pause that makes the melody of existence more profound. In this framing, death is not an illusion in the sense of a cheap trick, but an illusion in the sense of perspective. What appears to be an ending is only the folding of one page before the next is revealed. And so we return to the opening mystery, death as the universal, death as the great unknown. Every culture has touched it, every individual will face it, and yet no one can fully define it. If the physicists are correct, our atoms are recycled endlessly, forged in stars and passed through billions of forms before finding us. If the mystics are correct, our souls journey beyond, learning and returning until wisdom is complete. If both are correct, then perhaps matter and spirit are not opposites, but two sides of the same infinite cycle. In the end, maybe the real illusion is not death at all. Maybe the illusion is our belief in endings, our fear that we are fragile, separate, temporary. The truth might be more radical, that we are embedded in a universe that does not destroy but transforms, that does not erase but reshapes. And if that is so, then what is left for us, here and now, is not despair but awe. To live as though every moment is eternal, as though every breath carries the weight of infinity. To treat others not as passing shadows, but as companions in a shared eternity. To build, to love, to wonder, knowing that even in silence we continue. Death may appear to close the book, but perhaps it only turns the page. And when it does, the story may be far grander than we ever imagined.